Welcome to the International School of Tailoring. My name is Reza and this is going to be your 14th lesson of our How to Make a Bespoke Jacket series. In the previous lesson, we looked at the canvas construction of the model that we're about to make. Before we get to make our canvas, me and you are going to take a deep dive into darts and wedges. Why? Because we're going to start using darts and wedges on the construction of our canvas. So today's lesson is all going to be about darts and wedges. If we look at our connection map, we'll see that darts and wedges are connected to construction, fit, gather, and the stretching of our material. Construction because darts and wedges shape the surface of our material. Fit because they affect the look and feel of our garment. Gather, being a subset of relative length, can sometimes substitute darts, and stretching, being a subset of ironwork, can sometimes substitute wedges. So this is what we're going to do. First, I'm going to show you how darts and wedges arise. After that, I'm going to go through the different types of darts and wedges, and last but not least, I'll leave you with a few exercises to sharpen up your skills. You ready? Let's go. Darts and wedges are one of the 5 subsets of relative length. We covered relative length along with the other subsets in lesson number 11, and in that lesson I also introduced you to the concept of surfaces. If you haven't seen that lesson, please go back and review it because you're not going to understand a thing of what I'm about to say. So, just as a reminder, in that lesson I talked to you about the objects and their planes. Every object is made of multiple planes. When multiple planes come together, they create a surface. We tailors work with 3 surfaces. The first one is a flat surface with no curvature. The second one is a surface with a positive curvature. That can be a cone or it can be a dome. The third one is a surface with negative curvature. So that could be a saddle or it could be an hourglass vase. Darts create shape for positive surfaces, surfaces with a positive curvature. Wedges create shapes for surfaces with a negative curvature. Let's see how that works in practice. Here we have 3 objects in front of us: a cube, a pyramid, and a sphere. All these 3 objects have a positive curvature to their surface. Now, if we take a piece of fabric and we put this on one of our objects and we try to lay this fabric on only 2 planes, our fabric is simply going to bend. Nothing else happens. However, if we try to cover the 3 planes of any of these objects, at least 3 planes, what will happen is a fold will arise, like so, on the intersecting point of at least 3 planes. If we remove this fold, that fold becomes our dart. So, on a piece of paper, it would look like this. We cover the top plane, we cover the side plane, and the other side plane, and as we do that, we remove that surplus. This surplus is what we call a dart. Now, whenever we remove the surplus by a dart, we are making the outer surface of our material shorter relative to the point of intersection. Why? Because simply we are cutting this out and that all goes to a point. It's really the outer edges that get shorter than the central point. Now we can do exactly the same on our pyramid. If we cover 3 planes, again we end up with a pleat, and we can do the same on the sphere. And although you can't see the planes on the sphere, they are there, and that results in multiple pleats because we have more intersecting points on a sphere than we have on a pyramid or a cube. Now, going back to the paper model, here we are removing material and making the outer surface shorter relative to the point of intersection. If we do the opposite and we make the outer surface longer by making a cut here and opening the material up and introducing new material, we are creating a wedge. How does that look like? Let's have a look. So Here we have a vase, and the surface of this vase has a negative curve to it. Right here in the middle, you see the intersecting point of the planes that create the negative curvature. If we put a piece of flat material on top of this area, you'll see that the intersecting area, well, where we have the intersecting point, the fabric does not lay flat on the intersecting area of our surface. If we try to cover it, you'll see that it distorts. Well, this is because the outer surface is not longer relative to the central point of intersection. So what we have to do is we have to make a cut, open the material up, add an extra piece, and that will cover everything smoothly. This is how it looks. If we make a cut from the outside towards the point of intersection, our material simply opens up and it lays flat and smoothly on our object. If we complete this off by adding an extra piece to close this gap, then what we have done is create or insert a wedge. Now let's see what the different darts and wedges look like. So let's begin with the first basic dart. This is the exact same dart that we had on our cube, and it's called the single dart. The single dart gets its name from the single point of intersection that it has here right on the top. This single point is officially called the apex of the dart, but I've never heard anyone use that term, so we are just going to call it the point of the dart. These two diagonal lines that you see on either side of this triangle are called the dart legs, simply because they look like the legs of a standing person. Our dart is then split in two with a line that we call the center line. Sometimes this line is also referred to as the fold line. And the reason why it's called the fold line is because this represents 1/2 of either side of our fold. So if we have a material and we fold this up, that line falls right on the fold of the material. And here at the bottom, we have what we call the intake line. This refers to the amount of material that is taken in. Because we have two halves to the dart, if we refer to 1/2, we usually say on the double. So 1 centimeter on the double. That makes a 2 centimeter dart in total. We can say 3/8 on the double. If we don't say on the double and we just say it's a 3/8 dart or a 1 centimeter dart, it means that we have to split that measure in two. Now, let's see how this dart looks on our paper sample. On the left-hand side here, we have a simple square with a basic single point dart right in the middle. And if we close the legs or bring the legs together, we are shortening the surface around the point of the dart, which is the intersection point, and thereby are creating a surface with a positive curvature. If we take this to the extreme, it turns into a cone, and the more we take away, the more severe that cone is going to be. However, a dart doesn't need to be in the middle of a panel. We can also angle the edges of two separate panels, and when they are put together, they can create shape. This happens, for example, on the shoulder seams. Let me show you how that works. So, if, for example, we have this big rectangle with a hole in the middle, and we would split this rectangle right down the middle to create a front and a back panel, what we could do is to introduce our shoulder angles, and that basically is going to be a single dart, and the shoulder angles are the dart legs. The double dart is simply the single dart taken, like so, and mirrored downwards from the intake line, which creates this rhombus shape with 2 points. It's a double pointed dart. Now, the terminology is exactly the same as the single dart. The only thing you have to be careful for is that there are 2 points now. So the top one is going to be called the top point, and the bottom one, of course, the bottom point. Why is this important? Because if someone says, you didn't sew the point of that dart really well, and it's a double dart, you should ask, which point? The top one or the bottom one, or both? Anyhow, although the double dart is simply two single darts taken and doubled, it has a very different effect right here in the middle part where the intake takes place. So let's see how this looks on a paper sample. Here we have a double dart. And if we close our double dart, we see that the area around the intersection points raises and creates a positive curvature to the surface, just like a single dart does. However, the interesting part about a double dart is that whenever we close it, if we look at the middle, we see a concave and a convex surface at the same time. This is exactly the same as a saddle, and we already mentioned that a saddle is a surface with a negative curve to it. And we also mentioned that it's the wedge that covers a surface with a negative curve. So this begs the question, is a double dart the same as a wedge? The answer is yes. This is how it works. Here we have a double dart which is split between two separate panels. If we bring them together, we can clearly see a double dart. Here we have one panel with a cut right there, and if we are opening this cut, here we have a wedge to insert in that cut to create our surface shape. Now, how are these two the same? Let me tell you. If we close one side of this double dart, either the upper half or the lower half, let's say like this, we have a flat surface whereby the two upper layers overlap, like so. And if I would mark the line here, right on this edge, we can see that we have a triangle underneath our top layer. Okay? On the other hand, we have a single layer and our triangle. The triangle is not attached, unlike the other one. So, if we insert our triangle underneath one half of our cut, we will have a triangle overlapped by one side of our single layer. So far, these two are now exactly the same, apart from a few aesthetical changes. Now, whenever we want to complete our wedge, we will open the cut, reveal the triangle, and sew that area close. By doing that, we make the outer surface of our material longer than this center point, which creates that saddle shape. The same thing happens here. Whenever we now try to sew the remaining of our dart legs and try to bring the upper legs together like so, we reveal our triangle and thereby make the outer edge of the surface longer than the center point, and that creates the same saddle shape. The only difference is that here our triangle is already incorporated into one of our panels. Here our triangle is a separate panel that is introduced between two cuts. So, let's see how these two react on fabric and how they cover in exactly the same way our vase. Here we have our vase back. If we take our fabric sample with a wedge and we place this on the vase, we can see that this fabric is covering the vase perfectly. If we take our other sample with the double dart and we place this on our vase, you can see that exactly the same thing is happening. It's covering the surface perfectly. This splitting of a double dart between two panels is exactly what happens on our side seams. Let me show you how. If we remember our front and back panels here, what we did was we introduced a single dart when we marked the shoulder angles. Now, if we take this back panel and we turn it around and align the side seams of the front and the back together, like so. Here we have neck curve, and here we have shoulder angle. and we introduce our side seam suppression, which is going to be something like this, we will notice that our side seam suppression simply looks like a double dart split between two panels. Now, if I draw a center line right here and a center line right here, these already look like finished patterns. So our conclusion really is that we don't need any more than a single and a double dart to cover the human form. Let's see how all of this reflects on a simplified human body. Here we have a simplified version of the human body. The surface of this body is made of positive and negative curves. Positive curves are anything that resemble a cone or a cup, and negative curves are anything that resembles a saddle. The intersecting points of the positive curves are indicated with the blue dots. Remember, on a positive curve, 3 planes make a dart. The intersecting points of a negative curve is indicated by the yellow dots. What are we trying to communicate here? Well, what we are trying to say is that if you can see a geometric shape of any object and you can identify the intersecting points of the positive and the negative surfaces, the negative and the positive curves, you can anticipate what kind of dart or wedge you will need to cover that form. So here, for example, imagine we don't look at the lower half. Here we can see positive surfaces and their intersecting points. So we already know we are going to have folds there. If we remove those folds, we will have a dart. The same happens at the lower part. Hey, here we have a positive curve, and that's the intersecting point of at least 3 planes. So we're going to have a dart there as well. In the case of the body, which is a bit of an hourglass shape, we also have a intersecting point of a negative curve between those 2 points that are positive. So when those darts come together, they create a double dart, and we have already seen how a double dart covers this vase shape form that we have on the human body as well. So if we take our double dart sample and we close it, we can see that it creates a cup for the bust, a cup for the hip, and it addresses the hollow surface in between. So if we put this on top there, it fits perfectly on the form. This aside, we also have a dart on the shoulder, but we don't see any intersecting points of 3 planes. The reason why we have a dart on the shoulder is something called shape by angle, which is another subset of relative length. We cover that in a separate lesson. For those of you who are staring at this point and are thinking, isn't this the intersecting point of a negative curved surface, and shouldn't that be marked with a yellow dot? Yes, that's true, but we will cover that in the shoulder theory of the pagoda model, because otherwise it gets too complicated. As for now, let's see how this looks on a real body with real fabric. So here we are with Mowgli, and on Mowgli's shoulders we have a piece of calico to demonstrate the hang of the fabric. If we are going to compare this to the illustration next to us and we're going to replicate what we talked about, we will simply begin by pinning the first 0 point of our dart, which is the blue dot on the bust, like so. Then we will pin the second blue dot, which is resting on the hip, and the area in between is going to be our yellow dot, and that's going to be the intake of a double dart now, because we have 2 points. Let me do the same thing on the other side. We have now covered the front surface of the human form, and if we close the sides, it will look a bit more like a proper garment or dress. And that should put everything into context now. And that's it. It already looks like a dress. If you want to really take it far and you want to make it sculpted even more, what you can do is simply remove some of the folds around the blue points that you have by introducing additional darts. Like this and like that. Now you can tell that we have just used a single dart and a double dart on either side, and that already has created a complicated shape. So we don't need complex darts to cover complex figures. However, in your journey, you may come across different types of darts and you may wonder, well, when are they used? They are all basically variations of the same single dart. Here we have one single dart. Another variation is the same single dart doubled, and so on and so forth. So let's cover some of those variations and see what the purpose is of those. The first variation that we have is called a dart with a pocket cut. What is a dart with a pocket cut? Well, here we have the dart, and here we have a cut that goes from the outer edge towards the intake, which is going to be covered with a pocket, hence pocket cut. Now, what is the difference between a dart with a pocket cut and a normal single dart? A single dart is usually introduced from the outer edge towards the center of the panel. However, a dart with a pocket cut rests in the middle of the panel. If we would try to close this dart, we would end up with a pleat underneath the intake line. So our solution is to introduce this cut so that the upper part of our panel can move freely whenever we are closing this dart. When we close this dart, the edges align and we cover those edges with jetted pockets or another type of pocket. Now, what you see here specifically is not often used on jackets. The reason is that the intake line of this dart should always land on the narrowest part of the waist. The narrowest part of the waist is usually too high to have this cut covered with a pocket, because we would have to reach all the way up our waist to get to our pockets. So the solution is to lower the intake line and thereby also lowering the pocket position. Whenever we do that, we end up with something like this. Here you see a single dart. The intake line is taken all the way down until it reaches the hip position of the pocket, and by the time we close this dart and cover the edges with a pocket, our pocket will be on the hips. Note that whenever we close this dart, like so, we have to add a little bit to the side, in fact the same amount as the intake, to make sure we don't end up with a gap. Whatever we add here is gently faded into zero, and our side seam will be unaffected with this dart. On a real jacket, it would look like this. I'm sure that most of you have seen this image. Whenever we close our dart here, if our pocket cut is on an angle, the fabric will slightly overlap, but if the cut is straight, they will simply meet edge to edge. Now, I can already hear you thinking. You might wonder, is it not a lot simpler to just put a double dart in front of the jacket? And the answer is yes, it is simpler, but here's the thing. Whenever we have a double dart, we create volume on the points of the dart. So whenever we sew this dart, there's going to be some volume here, which is taken up by the chest, and there's going to be some volume here. However, we don't have a lot of mass on the front of our hips. Most of that mass is on the sides. What will happen is this bubble that we then end up making is not supported with anything underneath it, and it simply will flatten. When it flattens, it usually goes to the front edge and distorts the front edge. So what we would want to do is to keep the lower part of the forepart as flat as possible. That means that our dart cannot go to a point. What we do instead is two things. Or we bring this intake straight down all the way to the bottom of the garment, or we bring it down until we meet the position of the pocket and then introduce that pocket cut. That is the reason why a pocket cut exists, and these are the ways to do it. Then we have the asymmetrical dart. To understand the asymmetrical dart, we first have to understand how a standard symmetrical dart can distort the grain of our fabric. So here we have a standard symmetrical dart. Whenever we place this on our fabric, we usually align the center line of the dart with the full stripe of the fabric. Whenever we close this dart, you can see that the stripes are coming towards the center line and create a V-shape pattern. Now, whenever we double this dart and we sew this dart, what will happen is that we have a nice straight sewing line going through our panel, but our grain or our stripe will come towards the center and then kick out again. That creates an X shape. So what we would do if we don't want to have this X shape and we want to align the full stripe along with the dart, we create an asymmetrical dart. The asymmetrical dart has one of its legs standing straight while the other one is at an angle. Whenever we close this dart, you can see that we keep one side of the dart parallel to the stripe while the other side has the stripes going towards the center line. Just like the standard symmetrical dart, we can double this dart, and when we do, this is how it looks like. Note one big difference. The center line of this dart is bent, while the center line of the symmetrical dart is straight. So whenever we sew the symmetrical dart, we always have a straight sewing line. However, whenever we sew the asymmetrical dart, we always end up with a bent sewing line. Another thing that I would like to note is that although one side of the dart is kept straight, it is not the case that this side won't be distorted on the surface, because we are always bringing both sides to the center. That affects both sides of the dart. As you can see, both sides are distorted. So, what do you do if you want to have the full stripe going through your dart and at the same time you want to keep the surface flat? Well, you would bring this surface, the surplus on the surface, towards one side of the dart and then remove that by taking either a dart, pleat, or a pocket cut. So you won't be able to use your double asymmetrical dart on a forepart like this for reasons that I just explained. What you do instead is you create a pocket cut so that by the time you close this dart, you can allow the surplus to overlap, remove the overlap, and keep that side that you want to keep flat, flat. The next variation is a curved dart. Obviously, a curved dart is an asymmetrical dart, and the question is, what is the difference between a curved dart and a straight dart? So, here we have a straight dart, and whenever we close this straight dart, we end up with a cone. Whenever we close the curved dart, we pretty much end up with exactly the same cone. So, whenever you look at it from above, you will see very little difference between the two. However, if you push a curved dart to the extreme and you turn it into a spiral, what you end up with is a smoother surface. So instead of creating a cone, we create a cup. Now, we never use this on our jacket, so this is just to highlight the extreme version of the curved dart. But the next question is, since there is very little difference between these two, why would we want to use a curved dart? And the answer is aesthetics. Now, you may see on some tailoring books that a curved dart is used on the front side of the body canvas to create chest. However, since there is very little difference between the straight dart and the curved dart, we can use a straight dart on the front side of our canvas as well. But sometimes on a lady's jacket, for example, what we do is we incorporate the curved dart as a side dart and combine it with our front dart to create a panel. Normally, this would be two panels and they would be cut from this line because that would be the pocket cut. But whenever you do it like this, you have to turn this into a smooth transition because if you would go into a straight line from there and a straight line from there, you end up with a point, and that's not so nice. So we use a nice curved dart to accentuate the curves on the body and to direct the attention of the viewer towards the feminine curves, for example, of the jacket. Now, if you imagine that this was cut, whenever we close this, we end up with a very curved forepart. The next question, however, is how do we close the curved dart correctly? This is what you have to do, and it all starts with the pattern. First of all, you have to allow this to naturally close. What I mean by that is you shouldn't pull this either way. Just put it on the table, allow this to close, and once it closes, mark notches going through the cut so that you know exactly which edge to match with which one. Once you've done that and you transfer this on the fabric, this is how it looks like. You will have your fabric. On your fabric, you will have the sewing lines of your dart along with corresponding notches. Now, the more notches you will have, the easier it is going to be to sew this dart. So if you ever have a curved dart and while you're sewing you feel that you need a few more, simply take a chalk or pencil, whatever you're making, and put an extra notch in between your previous notches. Make sure that you do this on both lines at the same time to have corresponding notches. So this is what I'm going to do now. Once you're done, you should have the same amount of notches on your lower sewing line as your upper one. Now, you may think that this is going to take a long time to do, but trust me, if you do this, you won't be fiddling around trying to match two opposing curves. This is what you do. You take your needle and your thread and make a knot at the end of your basting thread. You insert your needle right at the point of the dart and come out on one of the sewing lines at one of the notches, like so. Then you will insert your needle in the opposite line on the opposite notch and come out on the same sewing line on the next notch. Once you've done that, you will have something like this. Let's repeat. Opposite line, corresponding notch, coming out on the same line, the next notch, like so. Now let's go all the way. Now, before you go into your last notch, make sure that you insert the needle so that your thread ends up on the other side, like so. So don't come out towards the right side again. Now what you're going to do is you're going to hold your knot and you're going to pull the thread, and pulling the thread will bring the corresponding notches together and make them match as they should, like so. Then you would have to turn around and do a back tack, and if you're doing this on a shirt, you wouldn't cut into your center line, but if you're doing this on a jacket or if you're sewing two separate panels, you would either already have a cut or make a cut. But before you make the cut, first make sure you fasten off. So let's just make sure that we have our bites aligned. 1, 2, 3. Like so. Now, if you're doing this on a shirt, as I said, you wouldn't make a cut in your center line. So this may look a little bit weird, but what you have to do is very simple. You would have to flatten all the surplus that you have inside your sewing allowance and bring all the surplus away from the edge, like so. You may have pleats or creases here and there, but if you're just careful with your fingers and you're manipulating everything in the right place, you should be able to position everything as it would. Then you would take the iron and just make a crease, and this fold line that you're creasing now is going to be the center line of your dart. So if we would remove our bastings, this crease would mark the middle of our dart all the way through. Now, on a shirt, that would be the end of it. You would go to the machine, and because you have been basting on your sewing lines, you would simply machine along your bastings, and that's your curved dart done. On a jacket or two separate panels, if you don't already have a cut, you can simply cut a quarter seam allowance, like so, away from your thread and stop right where your folded edge becomes the quarter seam allowance. Then you would have to press your seams open, like so. Obviously, you would do this after you've machined your dart. And you would turn the remainder into a pleat. You can simply pleat downwards, or you could try, although not so easy, to open up this pleat and distribute it into two directions. For example, with a pencil, you could put that there and pleat it in both directions. It's a lot easier to just pleat it in one direction, but sometimes it is worth the try because you will have a flatter seam on both sides. So once you've done that, you can use your spray bottle or whatsoever, and that would be your curved dart closed in the most effective way. Then we have the hammer dart. The hammer dart is called a hammer dart because it looks like the end of a metal hammer. It is very similar, as you can see, to a curved dart. It basically is a geometric version of the curved dart. What is the difference? Well, first of all, whenever we close our curved dart and our hammer dart and we compare the two, we would see very little difference. Both of them create the same cone as long as they have the same intake, and there is very little difference to be noted. However, there is one big difference, and that big difference is that with a hammer dart, we have two parts. That allows us to change the angle of each part and also the intake. So, where is a hammer dart used? Well, a hammer dart is mainly used on a jacket to create shape on the chest just behind the break line. Imagine that we wouldn't have this part of the hammer dart. This would be a single dart. Obviously, if we want to introduce a single dart, we can't just do that right in the middle of the panel unless we have some sort of a cut somewhere, and that cut is then placed on the break line because it's the least visible area of our jacket. It simply hides behind the lapel fold. So, whenever we close this dart, we create our chest shape, and then by the time this lapel folds over and the dart is closed, we would have this curve shape which would rest on the chest of the wearer and give a good fit. That's it. Then we have tuck darts. Tuck darts are usually used to create pleats or to hold pleats down. So imagine here we have a basic simple pleat, and if we would want to hold the upper part of this pleat down, we would simply fold our pleat, fold this layer over, sew on the fold line of our pleat, and then curve it gently into 0 right at the edge. This point is, for your information, the middle of the pleat, which is not going to be visible. So, first question, why do we curve this? Well, if we would go into a point, we would have all the pressure on one point. Whenever this pleat wants to open up, all that pressure is on that one point. But a curve does a nice job in redistributing the pressure so that when we are using our garment with the pleats, we don't rip the fabric. So this is one version, and it's mainly used on trousers. So whenever we have a trouser and we have a pleat, we can simply close this pleat like so and sew the top of that pleat just as I've explained to you right here, and that holds the pleat of the trouser down right at the top, like so. The reverse of this tuck dart is like the following. Here, instead of having the intake right at the top, we have the intake right at the bottom. So what does this do? Well, it creates the same pleat, or it holds down the same pleat, but because it begins from 0 right at the top, it gives the effect of a wedge. Whenever you have a wedge, it creates a concave surface, and you can use this concave surface, for example, on the shoulders of a garment that you're working on, or on the waistline of a garment, or any other areas. These two are the most commonly used, and that's it for the tuck darts. The last variation that I'm going to show you is a variation on the wedge, and that is a curved wedge. What is the difference between a curved and a straight wedge? Well, if your line was a curve and you cut that line and you open it up to the same degree as you would open a straight wedge, zero difference is going to be between them. Here I have opened them to the same degree. I put them on top of one another and they just sit nice and smooth without any gaps in between them. However, if you take a straight line and you cut that line, but you open it so that one side is kept straight and the other is bent around in a curve, you are going to concentrate all of that shape right along your curved line. Here you can see my wedge can be transferred all around the material surface right from that central point. But if I try to do that here, it's going to be a lot more difficult for me to do. It just doesn't flow naturally. It bends and warps in all different ways and always wants to go back in this position. This is ideal if you want to use this wedge on the shoulder area of your canvas, because that will keep the front part of your canvas flat and concentrate all of that shape around the arm and the shoulder area. That's it. So let's summarize what we covered in this lesson. There are three surfaces that we tailors work with: a flat surface, a surface with a positive curve, and a surface with a negative curve. The positive surfaces are cones and domes. The negative surfaces are saddles and vases, hourglass vases. Now, folds will appear on the intersecting points of at least 3 planes on a positive surface. The folds that we remove we call darts. The opposite happens on negative surfaces. There we don't get folds on the intersecting points of at least 3 planes. We require extra length. That extra length that we introduce we call wedges. As long as you understand these principles and you can see every form around you as planes and you can identify the intersecting points, you can visualize the pattern of pretty much any object. So, on that note, to sharpen up your skills, I've got 3 exercises for you. The purpose of the first assignment is to train your eye. I want you to be able to see any object around you as simplified geometric forms with planes. What do? I want you to redraw all these objects around you as simple as you can. So, for example, here I have a sellotape holder. It's already a simple object. It's already geometrical. So all I have to do is to really redraw it. So if I'm redrawing this, I'll look at this and say there is a front plane, side plane, top plane, and I would just try to redraw these as good as I can. You don't need to make a masterpiece. The purpose here is to just recognize planes and make sure that you can replicate them on a piece of paper. Once you've done a drawing like this, you can then look at the intersecting points and ask yourself, are these positive surfaces or negative surfaces? Once you've done this with like 10, 15, 20 objects, you could easily look at anything and see it in planes, because we will require that for the next exercise. Let's say you've got really comfortable with the first exercise and you have the ability now to look at any object around you and to simplify it in your mind. You can see it as a geometrical object with planes. What I want you to do now, as the second exercise requires, is to translate what you have in your mind or on paper into a 3D object. So what you do is you just simply replicate this. You try to look at your drawing, you say here we have plane number 1, 2, 3, you draw them out on paper and just assemble it. Have fun, play around. Why is this important? Well, here you develop the ability to project things into your mind based on looking at objects around you. I want you to be able to turn your projections into objects that you can turn in your mind. This will develop your mind's eye. When you're drawing this, it's just flat surfaces from one dimension, from one view, from one angle. When you're assembling this, you're turning it upside down, you're flipping it, you're really playing with it. So that increases your ability to see things in space, because we will require that ability for the next exercise. This is where the fun begins. Let's say you've done assignment number 1 and 2. You're pretty good at making things from multiple planes. Now I want you to make an object with one plane only, and the shape that you're going to put into that plane comes from darts and wedges. So what do? First of all, take a good object, something that has positive and negative curves to it. I'm using a pipe, perfect object for this exercise. What you have to do is to draw out your object in a 3/4 view. Don't do like a side view or a front view. That's going to be too flat. You should have a good sense of what the object looks like in space. Once you've got the drawing down, I want you to draw out the planes and then identify the intersecting points of the positive and the negative surfaces. So once you've got that, we're going to begin with our rectangle. This red line is just simply the mirror line. So we're going to do half pattern because it's a lot easier. And you're going to mark out your one panel. Then you're going to roughly sketch out the gist of this object. So in this case, if we're going to be very rough with it, it's going to be something like this. Very simple. Then you're going to copy those planes that you've drawn onto your simple drawing. So let's say here we have a grid, here we have a grid, here we have this, and something along these lines. Now that you have your grid and it's similar to your drawing, I want you to highlight the points of interaction or intersection, sorry. And you're going to do both the positive and the negative ones. It doesn't matter if you have here like 6 points of intersection and here you only have 2. You just want to get started, okay? You're going to fine tune this later on. After that, you're going to say, well, okay, here's a point of intersection. That's a positive one, so we require a dart there. Since the upper part and the lower part of this bowl is round, our darts are going to be placed roughly here. If we close these darts, we are creating this round cup shape. And here we have a negative intersection, and what we require here is a wedge. Where do you put the wedge? Well, the simplest place to put it is just here. And then we can open this up later on, insert our wedge, and see how much exactly we need. You can also put the wedge at the top here, right between these angles, but it gets very fiddly if you want to make it. So try to use what you already have as your starting point. Okay, then we're going to say, well, this is a round pipe, but this is just a square. So let's fine tune this. And what you're going to do is you're going to begin to fine tune the contours of your pattern. To give yourself some clarity. Like so. Now, once you take out your darts, and you introduce your wedge, you're going to end up with something that looks roughly like this. On the left hand side we have the initial pattern, and on the right hand side we have the same pattern put together with sellotape. This is the moment that you can look at your work and see if you got it right. Depending on how much experience you have, you will be way off or really close. From this moment onwards, you're going to just fine-tune your pattern. Here you can see I've marked some lines, I'm changing some angles, I'm reducing some of these curves. And once you do that, you fine-tune your pattern and turn it into something more sophisticated. Clearly you can see the lines are better, the darts are cleaner, the angles have changed slightly, and a dart is introduced. But this is just a fine-tuning process now. The general principle is still the same. The darts are exactly at the same points and the wedge is there as well. Once you go ahead and put your final pattern together, you end up with a nice 3D object which resembles the original object that you're trying to replicate. And this is all just simply made of one panel doubled. And if you really want to go all the way, well, you can just simply make a stem and finish it off and add more details. If you can make an object like this purely by observation and the principles I taught you, believe me, you will be able to make patterns for anything. I hope I've inspired you with this lesson and all the exercises that I've given you. And now I want to tell you something though. Don't think for 1 second that just because you've seen me do these exercises that you can naturally do them as well. It is very different to understand something in theory than to do it in practice. And I want you to do this at a practical level. I want you to take these exercises and do them over and over and over again. The whole reason that I'm able to explain to you these principles is because I've done them hundreds of times. Good tailoring is nothing more than all these principles performed well. So why don't you inspire us on the community page of our website? Share your work by clicking on the link in the description of this video, while I, in the meanwhile, enjoy my thinking man's pipe, the good old Peterson. My name is Reza, this was today's lesson, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Take care. Volgens mij moet ik nu wel weer de achterkant gebruiken. Okay?